Hello everyone and welcome to our WaterlinePRO optimization tutorial. Now in this video we're going to show you how to get the most performance out of Waterline. Now starting off, just something to let you guys know that this is our 5.2 version, which isn't fully out at the release of the video. It's kind of in testing. So there will be a couple of things that will not be immediately available to you but should be coming in a few weeks or so, because it's right now in testing. So to start us off, we're actually going to go initially in the project settings and discuss something that we showed you in the getting started tutorial. So going into project settings, we did add or tell you to add another channel for collision object called Waterline and set the default response to overlap. Now, this is a pretty good setting just to get everything up and running immediately and super fast and super smooth, but it's not the optimal way of doing things. Now, this is something that you may need to decide on a per project basis, but this basically means that absolutely everything in your level will be overlapping Waterline by default. So for example, if we go here and if we have a cube and check its collision, we're gonna see that Waterline here is set to overlap. Now, if this is a project with a very few actors that are floating or just a couple of ships, this is a great way to speed up your work, as pretty much everything will be automatically interacting with Waterline in terms of generating wakes or floating, buoyancy, and all of that good stuff. So this is pretty good in general. But what if you have a large open world or just something with a million of static meshes and rocks and plants or underwater corals and features? Well, this setting here will mean that they are all set to overlap immediately. And it basically means that everything will be included. Waterline will be looking at everything in your level all the time. And this is not ideal. Now, for those types of cases, you may want to get here and set the default response to ignore and then accept. And I believe you may need to restart the editor, but then all of this will go back to ignore. And then basically these objects will not be included by default in the Waterline simulation. But then there will be an extra step where you need to go to collision presets, set it to custom, and then manually set Waterline to overlap only for actors that you want to be generating waves and floating. It's not too much work, but again, it depends on how your level is structured. So for a large open world level, pretty much everything will be set to ignore except for a couple of probably physics objects, boats, or characters that are meant to be like moving across the water and generating waves. But the majority of plants, rocks, and trees that are generally static and don't move at all will be ignored. So again, this is just like a quick thing of deciding what's the overall majority for your project. So without further ado, let's dive into optimizing your ocean. Now, as mentioned before, this is a brand new version and we actually have a really cool new feature that will improve performance for a lot of people. So let's start our ocean simulation. And right now, this is running at a full-on 1K resolution. In our latest update, we are bumping this up to 2K. We did have a version in testing that was running at 4K, but that produced a lot of issues. And you are really hitting diminishing returns at around 1K and possibly 2K. But let's see what's going on here. So the ocean is looking pretty good. And if we were to check our frames per second, and really set them free, we are getting quite a big bump in performance here. So your original version might be working a bit slower. We are seeing some dips as we're recording here and basically the stuff gets affected, but during play this does not occur. So what's going on here? Well, the reason why it's running this fast is that we have introduced a brand new feature, well, basically called Ocean Sim Frame Rate. And this identical setting is also available for water simulation. So what does it mean? Well, basically, we are running our ocean simulation at 24 frames per second, which is, let's just get it here, which is pretty much the minimum you need for a smooth motion. Now this makes very little difference in the overall scene, as your project will be running much faster, whereas the ocean will be running at a lower frame rate. But again, 24 is pretty much the minimum you need for smooth motion. We can bump this to 30, and you could see the motion getting a bit more fluid and nicer looking. But again, depending on hardware, this is something that you might want to play around with. If we go for something really low like 10, we are starting to see some stuttering and yeah, basically horribleness. We can go to 60, get some really nice motion, and bump it up all the way to 100, and we can really start to see our frame rates just getting halved at this point. Possibly 120, and there we go for high-end monitors. But again, this is something ideally you'd want to make set in your project in general. We recommend not going lower than 24, as 20 can start seeing some slight stuttering. We're not quite sure how well this will come across in the YouTube compression, but 24 is great. And again, you can set these independently for the two simulation types that we have, the ocean and the shallow water sim. So for example, if we hit play, we can see that all these ripples that our character is doing are getting simulated at 24 frames per second. Now, you might notice that the frame rate isn't too high, and that is because we're rendering this at a 4K resolution, and we might have a bit of upscaling actually. Towards the end of the video, we'll be optimizing things a bit more, just to see where things land. So there we go. These at the moment are the greatest ways to gain performance for your simulation. You can set these independently. For example, if shallow water simulation is more important to you, you can set that to 30, 30 or 60. And now if we were to go here, now something with the shallow water simulation is that changing this value will affect things like the height of your of the wake being generated behind objects that move. So pretty much set this at the beginning of the project and then start adjusting things like water simulation height and, well, basically height. Yeah. So for example, right now, if we lower this to 2, we're getting pretty much the same results, and the normals are a bit harsher, but we can adjust up here, going sim normal power -1, so maybe -0.5. And we're getting, it's still a bit too harsh, but it's getting there. So basically, these are the values that you need to look out for. The great part in this is that it will be a bit more of a constant way to set simulation, especially if you're generating foam and then rendering things out at different frames per second. Let's just return this to the way it was. So next up, let's look at the ways that we can optimize our ocean. So basically what we've shown so far, the simulation is they're kind of universal across other actors as well, or rather let's jump into water simulation. So at the moment we've kind of have simulation resolution, and this refers to our play mode when the character is moving around and interacting. And this has two values, simulation resolution and simulation texture resolution. And also simulation range are basically the ones that you need to pay attention the most to. Simulation range, you can kind of see here, is how far out the water will be simulated around your actor. Now during play, this kind of area will be centered around your player, and across this area is basically these two resolutions are being stretched over. So the larger the simulation range, the higher resolutions you will need most of the time, depending on what you're after. So right now, for example, simulation resolution is the quality of capture, and that is for location and shape of our actor. This is the more expensive setting, so perhaps in this case, if we lower it to 512, we're not seeing too much of a difference, and this is a huge gain for performance. Now we can see if we lower it even lower to something like 256, it's still looking pretty good, though we are getting a little bit of a stutter. Now this kind of depends on what you're after for your game. If it's large objects, you can lower this even further. Right now we're kind of basing this around the default third-person pawn. So let's see what happens if we go really low, like 128. We can see that things are still looking quite good, although we are losing a bit of the quality of the capture, and finally let's go to 64. Hopefully this will illustrate what happens. Yeah, there we go. Now with the ocean, it's not too obvious because there's a lot of things going on, but we kind of get this capture once every pixel essentially, and the pixel at this point is massive. So we don't have enough information for a continuous motion. So at a value of 8, a range of 8, simulation resolution of 64 is too low. Let's see what happens if we set this to 4 and hit play. We can see that we are getting continuous motion, although we're getting a bit of that stepping, stuttering kind of thing. So this is kind of like how low can you go in terms of memory, because this is pretty much what this costs on the GPU side. But yeah, play around, see what objects, or rather scale of objects that you have. What we had originally of 1K here and 1K for simulation texture resolution is a little too high. We generally recommend about 512 and for an area of 8, and then maybe 1K for texture resolution. Now, texture resolution will tell is basically the size of the canvas on which the ripples will be drawn based on the capture. So the higher quality that this is, the more detailed ripples that we will be having. For example, right now we're capturing at a low resolution, but we're having a lot more ripple information, and it's looking much more nice and detailed. So we have basically halved and doubled this value. I wouldn't recommend going with 4K on this because it's a very heavy operation, but just for the sake of things, it is something that you can do. And we are getting some sort of a little bit of a stepping artifact in the background. And at this point, we may want to increase the frames per second a little bit here. So 24, let's set it to something like, whoops, 30. It's looking a little better. And let's try for 60. So things are looking a lot more smooth and fluid right now. But again, it depends on what your project wants to focus on, interaction of the water ripples or the overall ocean. And again, the lower these two values are, the better performance that you will be getting. Next up, when it comes to ocean simulation, now the previous setting is pretty much universal for lake actors, localized water sim actors, as well as infinite water sim actors. And the ocean simulation is, well, pretty much unique to the ocean actor. So the thing to worry about here is basically the FFT resolution. That is the most, that's like your largest bottleneck. And generally for real-time projects, a value of 512 is pretty good. Now, the moment you change it, you will notice that things have gone very kind of pixelated. And that is because once we change the FFT resolution of our simulation, we also need to adjust the resolution of our rendering target. So first of all, let's open up our render target for ocean height. Now this is our displacement, and we need to set the X and Y to 512, what our FFT simulation is. And when we go back to our project, things are looking a little bit smoother, and we need to do the same thing for our normal. So let's open this up. Now the unique thing about the normal is that it can be, let's move this to the side for now, that it can be double of our current FFT resolution. So in this case, 1K. So let's set it to this. And go back to our map, and you could see that things are looking pretty much nice and smooth right now. Now we could also mess around a little bit with the FFT texel size, so around 10 to sharpen things up. But we are seeing some jaggedness right now. And basically, to remove this, let's pause our simulation so you can see things a bit better. Now our smallest wavelets, this is coming in our latest update, are producing these sort of jagged artifacts. And the best way to get rid of these is to open up pretty much all of our materials, and we have a brand new setting which you may have seen in the previous video called use displacement MIP smoothing. So we enable this, our surface recompiles, and right now we have smoothed them a bit, maybe too high because it's a default value of 1. If we go back to 0, you can see that we get a lot more detail, but these sort of teeth start showing up. So a value of 0.5 is pretty good in this case. And yeah, let's play our live ocean again. And we're now rendering at half the resolution that we were before, and things are looking pretty great. But because of this new setting, we can actually drop things even lower, and this will help older GPUs a bunch, since FFT resolution is being, like, the lower this value is, the quicker the simulation is, because there are less stages that need to be resolved. So let's go as low as 256 now. In the past, this would be pretty horrible and unworkable. And right now, it's looking like that, but we just need to adjust our render targets. So our normal is going to be double again. Our height is going to be identical. And there we go. Things are starting to look pretty good. We are getting some squares here, and this is from the normal map. And basically, we need to change the scale of the FFT normal texel size here. So from 10 to, let's see, 15. Things are looking a bit smoother. Let's try 20. 20 is pretty good. At 25, we may be losing some details, but again, this is a number that you can mess with and get a feel for. Now at this point, we are getting some of that jaggedness back, so maybe it's time to bring our MIP value to 1. And things are looking pretty great. Right now, we're running a 256 FFT simulation, and yeah, things are looking pretty good. Now, from the start of the video, you may have noticed that the overall visuals of the wave have changed a bit. And that is because of our new settings that we used to bring in detail. And these are micro FFT displacement and micro displacement. So we have these two new settings. Basically, we could turn them off by using micro displacement and setting this to 0. We'll be going over these in more details in a separate video. And this is what our 256 FFT simulation looks like. Now, at the moment, with the settings for, let's see, which one was it? Simulation scale of 50 and the overall tiling that we've set, the biggest drawback at the moment is tiling. Now, if we move at a sort of higher place, and let's just disable foam for now, we could see that there is very little tiling noticeable, but as we get close, patterns do emerge, and that is pretty much the only limiting factor at this time. Now, we could change the simulation scale in a bit and adjust all these other settings. But if you want to know a little bit more about these, have a look at our ocean simulation and ocean material videos. So let's bring the foam back. This is what our raw ocean simulation looks like. Now, we have lost a lot of details because we're rendering at 256. So let's bring some of those details back. Now, the cheapest to render version is a micro normal power, and this is a brand new feature that we have. If we set this to 1, we're pretty much bringing this sort of extra ocean simulation data, and at 1 it's a bit too strong, so maybe 0.5, 0.2. At 0 you can see the effect, and at 0.3 and 4 you could see that it's kind of nice way of sharpening up the waves, bringing an extra bit of detail going on here. Maybe 5 is too strong in this case, so something like 2 will also work. But if you want an extra bit of detail now, at this point, if we use micro displacement, this will add a little bit more rendering, but overall it's cheaper than rendering at the higher FFT resolution. So let's enable this, and at this point this value becomes meaningless, it's useless. And now all of this little micro FFT becomes, from just purely a normal map, a full-on displacement map, which is also calculated for normals, which is why we have these details. And let's just set this to 0 for now, and also just hide the foam so we can see what's going on. And the difference is that we have settings for height and choppiness for these small FFT details. So for example, let's exaggerate things a bit, and yeah, you could see them in action. So the height at the moment is a bit too extreme, so maybe 0.5, and let's lower the choppiness to 1. And at this point, we really want them to sort of just highlight the overall simulation and sharpen it up a bit and not overwhelm it. And this is looking pretty good at the moment. But what if we want even more details? Well, this is where the setting beneath it comes in. That's micro displacement. And for it, you have height, speed, and tiling. So let's set the height to 1. or maybe 2 even, just so we can see what it's doing. And that adds a little bit of an extra animated noise to the overall ocean. And the tiling of 20 might be a bit too high, something lower like 1. And we can just lower the height to something like this. Now at 0, you could see that our pure FFT simulation is looking quite smooth. At 1, we're starting to break it up a bit. And the tiling can be anything you want. So 10 is something that we are just kind of using to bring detail on a smaller scale, but something like 50 can also do. And then the speed, we can increase the speed by quite a bit, and it looks like the sea is almost boiling. But at a lower FFT resolution of 256, or rather the render target resolution being low, we are getting some kind of a shimmering effect. And that is because the pixels that are being written to are quite large, even if they are filtered. So a speed of 1 in this case is pretty good. And maybe we can bring in some micro FFT displacement choppiness. And now we could see that our ocean is looking quite nice and sharp. And we are using pretty much a quarter of the resolution that we did at the start of the video, with, at the moment, because of the settings for simulation scale and amplitude and wave tile FFT just being so low, just set for a small scale, that we get a bit more tiling that is visible. Although if you look, once we kind of move the camera away, our anti-tiling sort of tech kicks in, and it's invisible. We do have a little bit of a cross pattern here, but that's not too visible in most cases. Next up, in terms of optimization, this is a pretty good start. And the final thing that you should also be aware of is the underwater surface. And we kind of touched upon this in our brief video last time, but you do need to make a decision if your project is going to be mainly above water, in which case disable this, and in your material here, these 2 settings should be off for 2-sided normals and 2-sided. So right now, if we were to go underwater, well, we don't really have an underwater, but that's fine. If you're rendering something or mainly dealing with ships and your character or camera doesn't go underwater, this isn't something that you need. And this basically allows Unreal to better cull all the triangles from our ocean grid. Now, if you do want some underwater effects for underwater scenes and above water, the second best option is to enable these 2. And now our material is going to recompile. Now at the moment, because of our sharpness, we are getting a little bit of some white streaks. In our previous video, we kind of addressed this. And if we go underwater, we're getting some really nice underwater effects and everything. If you do want to get rid of these streaks, just lower the choppiness settings on the ocean and the micro displacement. But if you want to keep your choppiness settings and get the highest possible results, then disable these 2 and then enable underwater surface. Now this is the heaviest setting for underwater effects right now, and that's basically because this sort of underwater mesh becomes like its own grid that has its own underwater surface material, which in a previous video, again, we discussed the settings that you can have. Next up, in terms of optimizations, again, depending on whether your project is mostly above or below water, you may wish to disable the FFT acoustics, as this is a real-time kind of photon tracing based on the ocean simulation, and this creates the really nice patterns. We also offer the ability to use patterns that are pre-baked. We have a small library of these, and our previous video kind of shows this off. And next you have the volumetric fog. Right now we're not using volumetric fog. Our faked underwater volumetric materials are quite nice for the default settings. But if you're, again, mainly underwater focused, this is something that you would want to use. And check out our previous video on how to do this. Next up, in terms of optimizations, the final thing to look at is your water material. And by that, in this case, we mean our water surface material. Now, the general rule of thumb is to have a look at these settings, and basically if something has a toggle or a boolean here, it will add to the cost. So for example, things like use sim normal. In this case, we are using ocean real-time water sim, so we do need these, otherwise our character will not make any ripples. Ground truth normals are very expensive. These are meant for cinematics and basically pre-made renders. Large normals add extra, and small normals add extra texture lookups. Apologies, texture samples. So again, depending on whether you need these, you may want to use the small ones in some cases just to add a little bit of extra detail, but right now we've got this pretty well covered, I believe, in this scale. Use horizon correction is a fairly light operation, and it does make the horizon just generally look better. Normal tile break does cost extra to calculate, but it's fairly cheap, so it's good to have this on. Use FFT normals. Disabling this will disable the ocean simulation normals. Refraction, this will add extra calculations. Basically, as many of these as you have off, except for maybe the MIP smoothing, as this will lower the resolution of our FFT. In this case, we're using it to smooth out the sort of teeth that you would have seen in the past. Use displacement breakup is like an additional rendering feature that's also increases cost. Use flatten ocean at a distance if we were to enable it. This is again mostly for cinematics, and this means that at a distance the ocean basically becomes flat, and it can be useful for removing some polygon swimming artifacts. And let's get rid of it. Next up, foam. You can disable foam altogether here by removing foam. Use dynamic foam is another separate function. In this case, we actually don't have dynamic foam in this project, so we might as well disable it. And we are using ocean foam. There is also another feature here, use foam highlights, that can make the foam look a bit better. We've kind of gone over this in our previous video. It can sharpen things up and add a bit more variety to it. It's based on the FFT ocean sim, so it looks animated and looks really well, but it can be quite expensive to render. But again, it's kind of how much you want to use things. Shore settings, again, will add extra calculations, and then these are things that also need to be set up here in your ocean actor. For example, ocean shore settings, and in this case also use foam. Next up, something new that we have is aerial wind VFX, and this will be mostly useful for cinematics, and this is basically to make large bodies of water look really nice from an aerial perspective, something you would see in a plane. And this is pretty much it. Just managing these settings and being aware of them can really boost your performance. Just make sure to test things thoroughly. And the biggest sort of tip is just to make sure that only objects that need to interact with the shallow water sim are interacting with it. And yeah, thanks for sticking around for this long. In a bit, we shall be applying these settings and kind of going to a slower machine and just kind of benchmarking the kind of results that we have. So thank you very much, and go make awesome things. One more thing to keep in mind when it comes to performance and optimizations is the reflections method that you're using. Now, as of Unreal Engine 5.1 and higher, water materials support lumen reflections, which can be quite heavy in scenes such as these, because in this case, it is literally half of the screen, which will be sort of software ray traced. So for a much better performance, try using screen space reflections whenever possible. If you do have lumen reflections, just notice that these can be, again, expensive. In this case, we don't have lumen enabled, so when we do it, they're kind of set to none in this project. Also, if you are using lumen hardware ray tracing, we also advise using standalone ray traced reflections, just because it is about the same in terms of performance costs, and at the moment we have found that these do look a lot better at the moment. And one more final thing, when working with your ocean, also keep in mind that using additional FFT buoyancy settings as well can have an impact on performance. This is buoyancy that is reliant on the ocean simulation, and we do have settings here to tweak the quality. For example, resolution. This kind of goes without saying, the lower it is, the less intensive it is, and the higher the resolution, the heavier it will be to calculate. On top of that, in this update, this is something that's upcoming, so it may not be available to everyone right from the start, but we have GPU-based buoyancy. And what this means, it's a fancy world position offset material function, which we can open over here. It is basically this, and you plug in into your normals and world position. If you have values here already, you can blend them in with an add node for world position offset and for blend angle corrected normals, and this can be your base normal and your regular normals here, and just feed this in here. Right now it's going to give us an error, but that's not too important. You have once you have this material function, you will get two new parameters in your material for FFT ocean normal power and simulation smoothing. The normal power kind of dictates the overall angle at which objects will be tilted based on the ocean surface, and simulation smoothness will smooth out some of the kinks so it doesn't look like the object is bouncing around too erratically based on the waves if you're running a very high resolution ocean sim. So right now it doesn't look like they do much, but if we hit our ocean and go into live mode, you can see that these are floating quite well. Now again, this is based on materials and it's calculated on the GPU, which means that if we go on something like on top of the cube, this is a GPU moment. So the collisions of the cube aren't really changing with this. So this is best reserved for something like ice or debris or just crates that are not essential to gameplay. For some more important kind of assets, we do recommend using the FFT simulation.